Hi, everybody. Today's Wednesday, October 1st, 2025, and Matt Ho joins us to talk about the what's going on in the world. And let's welcome Matt.
Thanks, Nima. It's good to see you.
And let's start, Matt, with the escalation in the Middle East.
Oh, I thought we were going to get the crazy out of the way and talk about Hegseth, but yeah,
Yeah,
let's talk
because
about the Middle East.
that's related to what I'm gonna
Okay,
get back to the question, to the main question. But
right.
looking at what's going on in the Middle East and the meeting, because many people are, when I'm talking with the people here in Brazil, people outside of Brazil, they feel that there is a connection between what has happened in the United States with Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump talking with generals, admirals, and what's going on vis-a-vis the conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East. How do you connect these? Is that related to those foreign policy issues for the United States, or is something domestic to what's going on inside the United States?
Well, yeah, of course they're connected. I mean, it's the same people, right? I mean, you've got a narcissist in charge of this country who is unhinged. He is unmoored in the sense that he has no principles other than those a narcissist or a megalomaniac would choose to embrace. Um, and in that sense, he's a posturing nihilist, right? I mean, so that's who's leading this country. And then you look at who his advisors are. And it is men and women who have made it into positions of power because they're really good sycophants. They're incredibly loyal. They are really great spokespeople. They will go to the ends of the earth to trumpet Donald Trump's name, or they are men and women who have risen to power because they are con men and criminals, just like their boss, or they are men and women who have done well for themselves because they've known how to climb the ladder in a rigged and corrupt, economic, media, and political ecosystem that we have here. So you look at the people who are directing these policies and put that on top of the inertia that comes from an empire, let alone a declining, failing, dying empire like the U.S. And so we shouldn't be surprised at the type of decisions and policies we see coming about. Even like this spectacle on Monday with Donald Trump forcing Netanyahu to telephone the emir of Qatar and apologize, and then releasing photos of it. I mean, this is all childish, immature, bullying behavior that the rest of the world looks at. And as much as people want to see Netanyahu get put in his place, he's not getting put in his place for any other reason than the fact that the Qataris gave the president of the United States a $500 million airplane. I mean, so all of this, again, is unmoored, it's unhinged, it's principleless. And so the questions that we have about why are these things happening in the Middle East? Why are these things happening in Asia? Why are these things happening in Europe, South America, Africa? We just bombed Somalia today for the 80th, or yesterday for the 80th time this year, right? The same day that Trump is going on about how in his speech yesterday in Quantico, why are we involved in places like Somalia? He has bombed Somalia 80 times just since taking office this year. I mean, so again, it's unhinged, it's unmoored, it's principleless, it's posturing nihilism. So what we're proceeding through here, what we're witnessing, what we're having to endure is, a game that's being played by madmen and fools.
Matt, do you think that Donald Trump, together with Pete Hegseth, are the main message in this meeting, in your opinion, to the generals and admiral? What was that? What
It,
were
it was,
they trying to do, to say?
yeah. I mean, the generals were a prop. There certainly was an element of get in line. These are our new standards. A lot of chest beating, a lot of macho nonsense by Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump. But they were essentially a prop. This was a photo op. This was because this wasn't anything that had to happen. I think that's been discussed over and over. But the fact that they live streamed it, these generals and admirals and senior enlisted leaders couldn't have watched it, just like you and I can. I mean, so the show of it all, of course, is so important for these people, right? For Hegseth, whose prime interest is optics. Hegseth's prime interest is image, right? And that's when you look at all the orders that he put forward yesterday, some of which are incredibly dangerous, such as restructuring the inspector general, right? I mean, but just that's part of a larger plan that they have to make it their military, make it a military that looks like them, believes in what they believe, and will be entirely obedient. This administration and the people in the national security side, in the homeland security side too, the whole thing. I shouldn't differentiate any of them. They have no fear about chasing out minorities and women from the U.S. military, even though they make up, I think, about 35 or 40%, maybe more, of the American military, because they would rather have a pure American military, a military that is white, patriarchal, and Christian, that they believe would be obedient, that fits their vision and their worldview, than having one that is composed of women and minorities and thereby tainted or impure. Or, you can imagine some of the phrases these people use to describe a diverse military. So, you have that aspect of this, but a lot of it too was a continuation of promulgating this administration, this regime's views and their policies. So, you take a look at what occurred yesterday. You had this commander in chief, again, who is explained before, a narcissist, a secretary of war, as we now must call him, who is concerned solely with optics and image. And then you have a theater of hundreds of generals, admirals, sergeant majors, sergeants major, command master chiefs, etc., in there, who sit silently and obediently as the president says that the next necessary battlefields for the U.S. military will be American cities. And then it's been silent since this president over, as we've seen the U.S. military be used to extrajudicially kill people, be used to assist in the detention, the brutalization, the arrest of American citizens and residents, and legal residents, I should say, without saying a word about it. Allowing this to go on without saying a word. And so when the president yesterday says to these assembled officers and senior enlisted, if anyone has a problem with it, get up and leave. No one gets up and leave. And I don't think many of us are surprised about that. And so this idea that's percolating on the blogs and the podcasts of liberal America, that somehow the United States military is going to do the right thing and stand up to Trump. Well, maybe that sure sounds like a good book or a good television series, but show me the evidence why you believe that. Because we witnessed yesterday, we witnessed hundreds of these men and women who sat there and listened to a president who has already utilized the U.S. military to carry out illegal actions, criminal, brutal, disturbing actions against the American people and legal residents, and who have done nothing to oppose that. These are the men and women who have sat by, and as the president of the United States has fired their peers, fired generals and admirals for no other reason than reasons of politics, race, or sex. They have sat by and watched it all. So this is where the real danger is. And these men and women in power, yesterday it was Trump and Hegseth, but you can extend this to Noam and Bondi, right? You can extend this to Rubio and Miller, whoever you want to point to in administration. These are men and women that are sadists. They enjoy power, and they're intoxicated by the idea of either humiliating, controlling, or destroying other people. And so the fact that you have all this, you put it together and you see where we've gone and you see what they're threatening to do, what they say they're going to do, including putting forward national security memorandums like the president did the other day, directing that the focus of anti-terror, counter-terror efforts in the United States across the entire line of government, so to include the U.S. military, will be to come after people who speak ill of anything that he likes, to paraphrase it, because the list is, it's if you're considered to be anything anti-war, anti-capitalist, any kind of anti-American, anti-family values. I mean, the list is quite long of who is now considered to be a terrorist by this government. Well, this is really these are incredible times that we're in, and they are very serious times.
Matt, how much of what's going on with the case of Venezuela is related to Rubio's obsession
Yeah.
with that part of the world, with Venezuela, Cuba? How much of that comes from the Trump himself?
A lot of it comes from Trump himself and from the people around him and from the national security establishment, the foreign policy elite, the fossil fuel and bank industries. Certainly, the idea that Venezuela, which has the largest reserves of oil, and people can poo-poo it and say, "Well, it's that really dirty, heavy, crude stuff." Whatever. You know, I mean, it's the largest reserves. You know, I mean, they'll refine it and make money off of it. I mean, that is all there. Now, Rubio is, to your point, though, Nima, obsessed. He is obsessed with Venezuela. He's obsessed with Cuba. His family comes from the region. His family fled from the dictator, our man in Havana, Batista, right before Castro and his folks took over. So Rubio is the right guy at the right time in the right place to see this effort that's been underway for decades now. I mean, since Chavez came to power. That was what, 99, 2000? When was that? I mean, that was a while ago. And we've seen successive coup attempts by both Republican and Democratic administration. And again, there's a latent anti-communism in this. There's a latent American cultural, historical, tie to this, right? Oh, communists, so we got to be against it. If you're a good American, you got to be against communism. So there's that easy political pull of it. But I think most of it has to do with the fact that we don't control Venezuela, that their leadership thumbs their nose at us. They don't salute and get in line like many in the region do and have done, because we've had a long history, centuries, of getting our way in Latin America, in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine. So this idea of for more than 200 years, we have said, this is our hemisphere, everyone else stays out. And we more or less have controlled it in many ways. That's why we went so crazy when Castro overthrew the dictatorship. I mean, one, it's communist. Two, it was our guy, our industries, our rich people, our ruling class lost a lot when Castro took power and the communists took power there. But a lot of it also too was just the revulsion, the affront, the shame the Americans felt for losing control of their hemisphere. And so I think there's a lot of that, I mean, so there's other things in this that makes Washington, D.C. salivate, not just the Republicans, but also the Democrats over Venezuela. And Rubio has positioned himself, and this is what he wanted. I think there's a lot of questions this past year, as we've seen a guy like Steve Witkoff take over a lot of the duties that the Secretary of State we would assume to be conducting. And I think it's always been this way, that Rubio just wants Central and South America. Like, he'll be involved as he needs to be, and he certainly is a neocon, so he is concerned about Russia and China, Iran, other things. He's a Zionist, but I mean, his main thing is what he stays awake at night. I'm sure what he reads about, the videos he watches, pertain to Latin America, to Central America, South America. So he has maneuvered himself to be at the right place at the right time in an administration that also, too, the larger picture of this, as we see, I believe, Nima, this perhaps understanding of Trump now that he's not going to get Russia, and others in Washington, D.C., that pulling Russia away from China is not going to happen. Duh. Right. But as that, okay, maybe we don't need Russia. Maybe some of their thoughts were Russia's got so much that between their oil and gas, all the other, everything that comes out of the ground there, Russia's got it. Maybe we don't need them. Maybe if we should really just, as this multipolar world is taking shape, maybe we should just concentrate on what we can really handle. So we're going to start making deals. We're going to start agreeing with the Europeans. They're going to go our way on Iran. We're going to go their way on Ukraine. We're going to keep those vassal states with us. They're hollow and they're empty and they're pathetic and weak, but we'll keep the Europeans with us because at least it counts for numbers on a numbers on the map or the chessboard or the column or in the column or whatever. But more to the point, if we get Venezuela and then if we get the rest of South America with all the minerals and metals that are there, well, then we don't need these other parts of the world as much as we might have thought we did. And we can go on moving forward confidently in our own block to take on these other blocks in this, multipolar world.
Matt, do you think that the peace plan that Donald Trump put forward is related to the situation of Netanyahu in Israel? Because I don't see anything practical comes out of the peace plan, because Netanyahu went he said in Hebrew to Israelis that he's not going to withdraw from Gaza. So if he's not going to withdraw from Gaza, what does that mean? What does the peace plan mean for any sort of negotiations? So it's just some sort of opinion, my opinion, that he's trying to help Netanyahu in terms of the internal policies of Israel, because there is a lot of pressure coming to Netanyahu because of the hostages, because of the prisoners, that may somehow alleviate the pressure on Netanyahu, because that shows that Hamas is not willing to negotiate. So we have to fight. We have to continue this fight against Gazans. Your take on that?
Okay, there we go. Yeah, I agree. I mean, immediately after this thing was announced, you can't even call it being signed, and the spectacle of it, right? And the silliness of Western media to describe this as a peace deal when it's just a pronouncement by two powers against another, saying this is what we intend. I mean, Hamas had not even seen this thing until late Monday night, until hours after it was announced that this was going forward. But then for Netanyahu, of course, to immediately, as you said, turn around and say, nope, our troops aren't leading, as well as, no, there will be no Palestinian state. And then when you read the text of this, and there have been plenty of people who have commented on this and torn it apart but the vagueness of it, the lack of details, and if there are any guarantees, the guarantees are only for the Israelis. There's no guarantees for the Palestinians. The Israelis and the Americans maintain a veto, essentially, to stop whatever is occurring at any time. I mean, so the charade of it, the farce of it, I don't think it's any coincidence that this is what was announced following what happened last week with all these nations, recognizing Palestine, the UK, Portugal, other Western nations recognizing Palestine. So the timing, of course, and you've seen the effect of it. The Italians, who had a warship with the flotilla that's attempting to break the siege of Gaza, which, as I understand, as we're talking now, is being intercepted by the Israeli Navy. So Godspeed and God bless those folks there. To those folks, but the Italian warship that supposedly was going to escort them, they turned it around. They sent it back. The discussion about banning Israelis from being in the soccer or the football championships, that's been pulled, and the excuse by, I think it was FIFA or the UEFA or whoever it was, was like, well, now there's this peace deal. We don't have to, keep the Israelis out of playing soccer or excuse me, football, right? Because we've got this peace deal. So I think we see in that is the main purpose. It's like with Trump and Hegseth, we were talking about the imagery and the optics rather than substance. I mean, you had today Israel Katz, the defense minister, tweet. So it's not even like a leaked statement. This is something he put out on Twitter, that the Israeli army has now completed its move westward across the Gaza Strip. They have fully cut Gaza from north to south so that no Palestinians can get through to the south without going through a checkpoint. And what Katz says is that any Palestinians that are still in the north will all be treated as terrorists or supporters of terrorism. I mean, essentially establishing on Twitter, on X, a free fire zone for the northern half of Gaza. I mean, this is the Israeli defense minister saying that we now have a policy in northern Gaza, as if they didn't already before, but saying it on Twitter, having the chutzpah to say this publicly, we are going to kill anything that moves in northern Gaza. You know what I mean? And so that gets buried from this, oh, there's a peace deal. Well, he really didn't mean it, or blah, 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 blah. So it really is. It was a public relations, a successful public relations for in terms of being used in Europe and the US. And ultimately, it will be meaningless. I think we've all seen this movie before. We know how it's going to go. And that what's being put. And now, of course, we're seeing the Muslim countries that supposedly were included in the formulation of this coming out and saying this is not the plan that we agreed to. That's not a surprise that these guys in DC and Tel Aviv changed this after meeting with the Turks and the Saudis and the Pakistanis and the Qataris and whoever else, and then turning around and say, oh, yeah, okay, we'll go with that. And then lying to them and turning around and saying something else. You saw this statement put out by 8 of these countries that didn't accept the peace deal. They welcomed the president's efforts. They were happy to see things like this progressing. They affirm the need for a deal. But you look at these statements from the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Qataris, the Saudis, the Pakistanis, the Turks, and whoever else, the Emiratis maybe. There's nothing in there saying we support this deal, right? I mean, so I think we're basically going to have to live through media garbage for the next couple of weeks about how Hamas is breaking the deal and basically giving cover to the Israelis to continue their genocide and their ethnic cleansing. And we'll see, as you can read into what Kotz said today, a furthering of the destruction of northern Gaza in a way that they've been attempting for the last 2 years.
What's looking at Donald Trump supporting Tony Blair being part of the deal, and Tony Blair is the sign of death and destruction for the region. How you can put him in charge of,
it makes perfect sense for them, though. I mean, these are, if you go to DC, Nima, like you come to the US, I'll meet you up in DC. We'll go to all these think tank conferences, and if Blair's in town or anyone else like him, you will see how they celebrate a man like that. The think tanks, the institutes, the universities, the praise, the joy, the adulation, right, will be nauseating, will be disgusting. You'll vomit. But that's how they see him. They see him as a great statesman. They see him as one of the key figures of not just the 20th century, but the 21st century. Right. I mean, this is the man who I don't even want to get into it because I'll get upset and start cursing. But so it's not. I think the resignation of seeing Blair being put into this is best expressed by George Galloway's reaction when he said when he saw this, he just tweeted out. Galloway tweeted out FFS, right, for F's sake. Like in the sense of just of course. And I'm sure just as the Americans will probably come out with a peace deal for Ukraine and put Victoria Nuland in charge of it, something like that.
I think the same, Matt, what's going on with the Trump administration is somehow the same way that we're witnessing, same situation that we're witnessing in the United Kingdom. They're policing, they're just, look at what has happened to George Galloway. Right. How can you just there is no reason for that. There is no place for such a behavior on the part of the government. When you do this to George Galloway, just imagine ordinary people there, how they can feel about the government.
That's the whole purpose, is to frighten them into silence. And we have here in the United States, we have secret police on our streets. We haven't seen them yet here in North Carolina, as far I'm aware. But certainly we have secret police running through the streets of the United States, grabbing anybody who they think is illegal based upon their definition of that. I mean, this is an affront to this is what we have in the United States right now is the very government that our founders warned us about. And as far as the Brits, they're suffering through this as well. I mean, and you see the popularity of their government. I just saw the ticker today that Keir Starmer is now the most unpopular prime minister in recorded British history. I mean, they've had a lot of bad prime ministers, I mean, so to get that, I mean, God, these guys, Starmer, Macron, Merz, they make our politicians here look like celebrities, I mean, like, but it's because they've embraced these policies that are ruining their people. And whether you come from this, from the right or the left, you've seen these centrist neoliberal policies that are also now heavily militarist, that are banking on attaching to a dying empire while trying to resurrect the century-old dead empires that they once were. And the consequence then, of course, is that their people are losing healthcare. Their people can't afford to heat their homes. Their industries are collapsing, and that there is no future for their children and their grandchildren. And again, whether you approach this from the left or the right, that is the understanding, because it's the correct understanding of what's occurring, what has been occurring. The migration crisis that people want to point the finger to, what's that from? Where did those people come from? Where are those Syrians and Afghans and Iraqis? Where did they come from? Why did they go to Europe? Because Europe was taking part in the wars in their country that were displacing and forcing those people to flee. And the fact that they can't even take responsibility or accountability for that, to see maybe a British or a French or a German, or a Scandinavian MP stand up. I mean, I know some have done it, but for the most part, and say, yeah, the reason why we've got so many refugees here is because we are taking part in bombing their countries. Have you seen that? I mean, besides for a handful in this country and that country, so what they're grasping at is they're grasping at this relationship with the United States, and they're grasping at the militarism that they hope will distract their population, and that will give them some type of identity, because they're wartime PMs, they're wartime MPs, they're wartime presidents, whatever, that will bind their people and force their people to support them regardless, because of the Russian bear or whatever.
Yeah. Matt, it seems that the war with Iran is going to happen finally, because they're moving a lot of weapons, fighter jets, aerial tankers to the region. And do you feel the same way? Do you feel that the war is coming?
I don't know. I for one thing, I don't think that the U.S. and Israel have been able to build enough THAAD and Arrow and SM-3 and Patriot and other interceptors, these air defense missiles, in the last 4 months. We fired off a quarter of our THAAD missiles at a cost of billions of dollars, over the course of 12 days. And knowing that the Iranians weren't going full bore at Israel. So the Patriot stocks, everything else, the SM-3 stocks, all these things that we produce a handful of a month, and some a handful a year. I think the SM-3 missiles, they only produce a couple dozen a year. So these are very important air defense systems that we can't replenish quickly. And that will be they've already seen we've seen what Israel is capable of in Iran. We've also seen what the Iranians are capable of. And the idea that somehow Israel is going to be able to land a knockout blow, no, they can't. They tried it. It was a sneak attack. They got away with it. They did pretty good. They killed a lot of military leaders. They almost killed the president, but if they did, what does it matter? There's a meeting this past week with the president of Iran, with many of our contemporaries and colleagues. Max Blumenthal was there, and Scott Ritter, and Judge Knapp, and others, Jeff Sachs. And, the President Pezeshkian was very clear that the Iranians are prepared in a way that they weren't prepared in the spring, that they won't be taken by surprise, and that they are now five, and in Pseskian's words, 5 to 6 steps in terms of what happens for each contingency, right? So it's clear you could kill 5 to 6 levels below the president of Iran, and they have the capacity to maintain their government, right? Same thing with their military. I mean, this is basic stuff, right? So, you know, in the military, you're taught to be able to do your boss's job, right? You know, the idea that you should be able to do your job 2 levels above you because people get killed, you know? And so the Iranians also understand that they, the effect that they had with their missiles was just starting to appear against the Israelis and the Americans. And so for the Iranians, excuse me, the Iranians had that effect on the Israelis and Americans. And so for the Iranians going forward, then the idea, I believe, would be to lengthen out any conflict, to stretch out the conflict, to make the Israelis and the Americans exhaust their air defense stocks, their air defense missile stocks, so that they then become vulnerable. You know, I mean, so we've seen that the Israelis can't deliver a knockout blow in one punch, which is what they need. We've seen that a longer war goes against the Israelis and the Americans. And, you know, the Iranians don't want to go into this, but I think that they've learned enough in the last 4 months to do better than they did last time. Certainly the damage that would come to both countries would be enormous. And, you know, but I don't know with the Israelis, all that is very reasonable, right, and logical, what was just said, but that's not who the Israelis are, nor is it who the Americans are. You know, you don't think Huckabee's saying, you know, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, he's not saying, oh, God will provide. He'll, you know, just as you were running short of oil during Hanukkah, we're running short of THAAD and Patriot and Arrow and David Sling and Iron Dome missiles. God will make them appear. I mean, these people believe this stuff. I mean, like, so, you know, I mean, I don't know what to tell you in the sense of like whether it will come or not. You know, certainly, well, I'll just leave it at that. Yeah.
Actually, I have no doubt that Netanyahu wants the war as soon as possible. But after all, it all depends on many factors inside Israel and in the United States. It's not just about Netanyahu himself, because he wants the war desperately, in my opinion, because his position is at risk. He knows that he's willing to sacrifice everything for his position.
I
This is a
think
danger of Netanyahu.
right, and I think his view is that he does see Israel as confronted by 7 enemies, and I think, you know, we can mock him for his map that he had where he scratched off one after the other at the UN, but you know, to be fair, Israel was successful in pulling apart and deterring most of the axis of resistance, with the exception of the Yemenis, right? I mean, either defeated them or went to a draw. And so, you know, does he want to complete that? Does he, in his vision of himself, see the need for his legacy to be the one who really achieves this ultimate victory for Israel? And so I think you're entirely right. And you could add in other things too. Certainly his situation in Israel with regards to his corruption trial and everything. You know, the fact the elections are now going to be within a year of the elections soon. This would shore up support in Israel for any peace deal, although we kind of discussed that it's not going to be anything of significance. So I don't think he'll lose the support of, you know, and his government will collapse. The other thing too, though, is that, again, the Israelis, their goal is the West Bank, right? So they've taken Hezbollah out of the picture. They've taken Syria out of the picture. They've deterred the Iraqis. They've more or less deterred the Iranians. The Yemenis are doing what they can. God bless them. You know, no, there's just, if there should be an award this century for those who are righteous, it's been the Yemenis defending Palestine the way they have. But ultimately, you know, how much effect is it having? You know, does he feel the need? Does Israel feel the need to further a war against Iran, particularly if they feel they could get the Americans to do most of the heavy lifting in that war, do most of the fighting, most of the bombing, do they feel they need to do that to make the conditions for the annexation of the West Bank better, right? So as you have these shaping operations, which is really what I see all they've done in the Middle East there, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, to prepare the space to take the West Bank, Gaza included in that. It's amazing that you could consider a genocide and ethnic cleansing to ultimately be a shaping operation, right, for something like the annexation of West Bank. But the West Bank's always been their goal. So would a war on Iran make it such that support for the Palestinian resistance in the West Bank would be dramatically reduced, whether it be from the fact that they can't be supported by other nations, particularly Iran, or by the fact that there'd be such a distraction with the U.S. bombing Tehran, right, that no one's paying attention to the fact that they've just carpet bombed neighborhoods in Tulkarm in the West Bank, right? So, does that make sense? But here we are again talking about what makes sense, what's reasonable, what's logical when we're dealing with genocidal maniacs. So I don't know.
Yeah. Matt, we talk about the situation in Ukraine before coming on live, and you mentioned the Tomahawk missiles that JD Vance is talking about, that sending Tomahawk missiles, and we're sending them to Europe. We're not sending them to Ukraine, but after all, they're going to end up in Ukraine, and they're going to fire those missiles at Russia. And looking at the range of these missiles, Tomahawk missiles, 8,000 miles, which would be 1,600 kilometers. It's deep.
Mhm.
And if they use that, capable of carrying nuclear bombs, which make them more dangerous in terms of the escalation between the West and Russia. Before talking about the details of what's going on in Ukraine, do you think that the United States, after all, would decide to send them to Europe?
I think this administration. Well, we'll see what. To be fair to Vance, he did say to the vice president, he did say this is the president's decision, and I think some of the reporting was a little aggressive in saying Vance said he's okay with it because he does. But the fact that he has obviously changed his position on this, Vance, and he was supposedly one of the more reasonable or he was one of the few that came into this administration that was not as hawkish on the war as, say, Mike Waltz or Rubio had been, right? Or Hegseth had been. His reasons for now supporting, when he was asked in that Fox News interview, reasons why he was supporting giving the Tomahawks were really quite disgusting. Again, remember posturing nihilists, as I said before. He said, well, before I was opposed to giving it to him when we were paying for it, but now the Europeans are going to pay for it. So by all means, we can give it to them. It just really makes no sense. There's no principle there. There's no values. And certainly there's no strategic thought behind that. Why? Because what matters who's paying for it if in the end it's going to be striking Moscow or St. Petersburg or what have you. One of the things most people probably understand this, but in case you don't, one of the reasons why Tomahawks and other missiles like that are so dangerous is because they can, as Nima said, carry a nuclear warhead. And there's nothing to tell the enemy, the side that's receiving these Tomahawks, whether it has a conventional warhead on it or a nuclear warhead on it. It's not carrying a sign. It's not flashing a light. There's no special radar signature it's giving off. You don't know if you're the other side, whether it's being launched at you is a conventional or a nuclear armed weapon. These weapons, which we are giving out more and more, both Australia and Japan now have Tomahawk missiles, of course, to be used against China. The capability of the Tomahawks, I'm not so sure of. They certainly are older systems that, of course, have been upgraded, but they're subsonic cruise missiles. They can fly quite low to the ground, and they are maneuverable, and they can go all around and everything to avoid radars or whatnot. But compared to some of the systems we've seen deployed, whether by the Israelis, by the Iranians, by the Ukrainians, or by the Russians, I shouldn't say the Ukrainians. I don't think we've really seen anything special on their end, although they have proved competent in many ways. The Ukrainians, don't want to take anything away from in terms of their own capacity to build things. We see the effect that they're having on the Russian oil system right now with their consistent drone attacks. But in terms of the advanced technology, I don't know how scared the Russians are of Tomahawks. But the fact is that there's a capability there that the Ukrainians don't have. It would be a very aggressive escalation of the war. It puts the Russians into very difficult position of having to determine what to do and how to react. It's occurring in a space where you have people like the head of Germany, Friedrich Merz, saying, we are not at war with Russia, but we're not at peace either, right? I mean, so you have this environment that now these are being put into, and it also proves the Russians correct. I mean, so much of this comes back to just Russian national security. Whether or not you like the Russians, Vladimir Putin, whatever, you have to acknowledge that an encircled country has a right to be afraid. And then, of course, if they're stymied or if they see the encirclement come even stronger onto them, to actually do something about it. And so much of this, you could point to and say, what about the American missile bases in Romania and in Poland that can fire these types of missiles? The new Typhoon American ground-launched Tomahawk missile systems, which I'm assuming is what they would give. These are things that are supposed to have been the Tomahawks, we said a year or so ago, we would start putting into Germany in 26, 27, or 28, some time frame, right? So, I mean, what does this do in terms of giving the Russians any reason to do anything other than pursue their efforts militarily? You can make the argument, well, we're just being tough with them. We're really just bending their wrist harder, trying to force them to come to some agreement. That's not going to work. And anyone who thinks that's going to work, you just haven't studied this issue. You haven't studied the Russians. You haven't been paying attention, just even these last 3.5 years. So this is ultimately like everything else. I feel like I end my monologues, by saying, this is a very dangerous situation, because it is. This is crossing just another red line. And just because the Russians haven't acted in the way that people want them to act when a red line is crossed, doesn't mean at some point they will. And we've seen, top it all off, because we should mention this manufacturing of this hysteria around what seemingly may be manufactured events trying to justify further NATO action against Russia, right? I mean, so what may be false flag events, but certainly things that were accidents that have been led to be made as Russian sabotage. I mean, remember last year we heard all about how the Russians were cutting the undersea cables in the Baltics. And, the investigations that were done by the Scandinavian nations have all come back and said these were accidents. But that didn't stop CNN and the New York Times and, the European press from running with their hair on fire about how the Russians are conducting all this hybrid warfare. And now we have these drones that were launched into Poland. We had the claims that 3 Russian fighter jets that were moving from one base to a base in Kaliningrad violated Estonian airspace. As far as I know, they haven't produced any type of radar tracks or anything to show that this is what happened. You had that story about Ursula von der Leyen's plane being jammed and having to circle for hours in the air, which we now know is complete garbage. Not true. Didn't happen that way. I saw today that they arrested another guy, some other patsy probably, for blowing up the Nord Stream. So I mean, you have all this. It's if you're the Russians and this is what you're doing. And, what incentive is there to really seriously have a diplomatic effort with these people? And now they're threatening you with tomahawks. Why, if you're them, why continue to go along with any diplomatic efforts? Because these people are insincere. They're liars. They're fabulous and fantasists. They're the madmen and fools we spoke about earlier. We talked about it's a class that the Russians have to be looking at these European politicians in the same way we discussed them earlier, as people who are incredibly unpopular, who are in charge of countries that are declining and rapidly getting worse and worse every year, and who see a foreign war, as has been utilized throughout human history, as a way to shore up support at home. The Russians understand all this, so what incentive do they have to come back to the table? Because I know that's been a criticism in the last couple of weeks from the Americans, is that, look, the Russians haven't agreed to bilateral or trilateral negotiations. We had this thing in Anchorage. We thought we'd move forward, and they're nowhere to be seen. And okay, I can understand that frustration, but come on, look at yourself in the mirror. Look, what are you giving them to allow them to say, okay, this is a smart way to move forward, as opposed to, well, we'll just continue to grind it out on the ground. We'll continue our policy of attriting the Ukrainian military. The Russians view warfare differently than we do. They view the loss of personnel differently than we do. They just do. These are different people in the sense that these are hard people who have objectives and goals that they believe are rooted in their national security, their true national security. And so they figure that the best thing for them is to continue to grind it out on the ground, then engage in a charade with Western diplomats that will ultimately go nowhere. And if it does produce something, will ultimately they'll be betrayed on, just as they've been betrayed numerous times. Minsk II being, of course, the prime example.
I think you put it out perfectly. What's going on with the mindset of Russians and how Matt, just to wrap up this session, when you look at Europe today, it doesn't seem, we thought that the Trump administration would influence Europe, but it seems that the blob, the establishment in the United States, has just dominated everything. And looking at Ursula von der Leyen, it seems to me that it's during the Biden administration, and she's talking about the conflict in Ukraine. Just look at what she said.
We live in troubled times. The Russian war against Ukraine is still ongoing. We see that Russia is testing our resolve. So these are times where it is absolutely paramount that we have a common sense of urgency and unity to address these challenges. And therefore this informal European Council in Copenhagen comes just at the right time. We're going to discuss two topics. One is defense and the other one is Ukraine. On defense, my commission has prepared a scoping paper to discuss the direction of action, but also, for example, flagships like the drone wall. And if it comes to Ukraine, if we all agree that Ukraine is our first line of defense, we have to step up the military support for Ukraine. This is the reason why.
Yeah, Ukraine is the front line for Europe. I don't see, to be honest, I don't see Russia sees that. Russia doesn't see Ukraine to be that much connected to Europe. They see Ukraine as their neighbor, as their main neighbor in terms of the security of Russia. This is a totally different view that we are hearing from Europeans.
Well, I think too, Russia is embracing a much greater global view. Certainly, because of the sanctions that were put on them, they turned eastward and southward, and they found great success there. And they found, countries that they traded with before, that the trading has, just grown by incredible amounts over those last few years. Partners that they can rely upon, partners that they believe will honor their word. And they see, as we were saying before, European nations that are ignoring their own internal problems, blaming their problems on everyone else, whether it be Russia or migrants or what have you, and thinking that the answer is militarism. Here's the head of the EU with all the problems in the EU right now, with energy issues, with housing issues, with migration issues, with industrial issues. I mean, the deindustrialization of Europe is massive. With the fact that they really should all be embarrassed the way they all cowed and bowed to Donald Trump over these last 8 months. None of them have really stood up to him. Gave him a sweetheart of a trade deal, and they all came to the United States and sat in front of his desk, like school children, through vassal states, and rather than taking those and a lot of other issues head on, they choose militarism. They choose, we're going to build bigger armies. We're going to build larger armament factories. Where the money's going to come for that? Who knows? It's going to come. I do know it's going to come from the people. Either they're going to tax their people more, or they're going to strip away benefits from the people, or they'll go into debt, which ultimately will have an enormous effect on their people. Their currencies will lose value, everything else. So they're choosing a path forward with the militarism that is just historically an absurd and ruinous way to go. And so the Russians look at that and they say, we don't need to have Europe be outside our front door. Europe can be outside our side door, can be outside our back door. I mean, the Russians historically view themselves as Europeans, right? But they also have, how big is it? 13 time zones, right? I mean, like I think the embrasure of a global posture, as well as again, this, I think we're caught up. I get caught up describing the multipolar world as like a coming multipolar world, and it's not. It's here. I mean, so people need to excuse me just because my language is not caught up to the reality of the times, But they understand that, and the line's been drawn. And certainly, I think if they could re-engage in a relationship with Europe where they are once again in some form of beneficial back and forth trade relationship, sure. But we've seen that. Where's that going to come from, though? Because the gas that once went through the Nord Stream pipeline before the US and the Ukrainians blew it up is now going to go to China, right? It's going to go through the Power of Siberia gas line, right? This massive, huge, biggest pipeline ever in the history of the world. It's to the world's largest economy. I mean? And then certainly the Indians with the fourth largest economy in the world, that's another partner for them. The Turks, they've certainly had their economic problems, but it's also a pretty big country that's pretty important with a history that they want to, I mean, so all that said, you look at the Russians, you can imagine them watching van der Leyen speak like this and just thinking of just how suicidal these Europeans are. They are willingly choosing to go forward in warlike and militaristic ways that are ultimately going to be ruinous for the Europeans. And they're putting everything they have on right now on Donald Trump and the United States. Who is going to be their backer? Who is going to be their guarantor? In whatever way. You saw a British economy that is just terrible. I can't even come up with a good word for it, with a prime minister who, again, is the most unpopular prime minister in British history. I mean, that's just, I won't stop thinking about that all day. I'm going to have to get on Google later and check that out to see who else is in that list, But, I mean, we just signed $400 billion deal to invest in Britain. American companies are going to come and they're going to get their pound of flesh from the Brits. Our American companies are going to end up doing better at that deal than the British are. But the British, they have nothing. They have no, I mean, where the Europeans could have gone 30 years ago, rather than swimming underneath the Americans like the little fish under the shark, eating whatever fish guts fall out of its mouth. They went along with the Americans in Iraq and Afghanistan. They went along with it, and I think they have a lot to do with it, not just Americans, but this anti-Russia nonsense of the last 25 years, right? Rather than saying, it's a new world order. We don't have to be vassals to this lone empire with the technological explosion that was occurring. Europe could have become a hub for innovation, a hub for education. I mean, certainly you look back and you say, how can the Europeans be in this position that they're in as a fault of anyone's other than their own. And I think that's the way the Russians look at it. So why, if you're the Russians, why do you want to get back into a relationship with the Europeans when you have these other partners who are reliable, who are rising, and who just frankly aren't liars?
Thank you so much, Matt, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
Thanks, Dima. I appreciate it.